It seems like everywhere you look lately, there's another story about student protests on college campuses.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, Columbia University especially has been in the news a lot.
Hmm.
And, our listeners have sent in some really interesting material about all this,
Yeah.
especially about like how things get handled when these protests will maybe cross the line into illegal activities.
Right.
So that's exactly what we're going to dive into today.
Okay.
Looking at this question of should student protesters be prosecuted when they break the law during these demonstrations?
Great. Yeah.
And to really get into it, we're going to focus on a particular opinion piece.
Yeah, sounds good.
It's by Julian Epstein,
Okay.
published in the New York Post on March 29th, 2025.
Got it.
The title is a bit of a mouthful. More than deportation. Trump admin should prosecute student protesters who commit illegal activity.
Catchy.
It is catchy, right?
Yeah.
But, before we even get into the specifics of the piece,
Sure.
I think it's important to acknowledge that Epstein is coming at this from a particular angle. He's the former Democratic chief counsel to the House Judiciary Committee.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So his perspective is definitely shaped by that legal background.
Interesting. Yeah. So he's got a lot of experience with how the law works and how it's applied in these kinds of situations.
So I guess the big question here is, what's the central argument that Epstein is making in this piece? What are we really trying to understand through this deep dive?
Okay. So basically what he's trying to do is lay out the legal reasons and also some historical examples to argue that student protesters who commit crimes, illegal acts, during these protests, they should face legal consequences.
Okay.
He's saying they should be prosecuted.
All right. So to make that case, he uses some pretty interesting arguments and historical comparisons.
For sure.
Like right off the bat, he brings up Governor George Wallace and the situation at the University of Alabama back in 1963.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's going way back.
It is.
So what's the connection there? Why start with that?
Well, Epstein's pointing to that moment when Wallace literally tried to physically block black students
Oh, wow.
from entering the university.
Yeah.
Directly defying the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education ruling.
Huge moment in history. Cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then he emphasizes how President Lyndon B. Johnson responded by sending in the National Guard.
Wow.
To make sure that the kind order was enforced.
Right.
And that, equal protection under the law was upheld.
Yeah.
So it's about this idea of consistent application of the law.
I see.
No matter who you are.
Everyone's equal under the law.
Exactly.
That's a powerful point.
It is. And then he takes this even further with a pretty intense analogy.
Oh, okay. This should be good.
It involves hate groups.
All right.
So buckle up.
All right.
He asks us to imagine what the reaction would be.
Okay.
If, let's say, the KKK.
Wow.
Or a similar organization.
Okay.
Started taking over college buildings, establishing these no-go zones where black students were excluded or felt unsafe, engaging in assaults and intimidation.
Yeah.
And even calling for black people to be removed from the country.
That's a scary thought.
It is. And he argues that there would be this huge outcry.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially from Democrats.
Yeah.
And then he says, okay, now replace blacks with Jews in that scenario.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see where he's going with this.
And he's basically saying that this is what he believes is happening on some college campuses right now.
So he's making a direct comparison
Exactly.
to these really extreme examples of hate and discrimination.
And he's implying that the level of outrage and the need for action should be the same.
Regardless of who the target is.
Exactly. To really drive this point home.
Yeah.
He then goes on to list specific things that he says have actually happened during these protests.
Like real examples.
Real examples with a particular focus on Columbia.
Got it.
What are some of the things he brings up?
So he talks about reports of Jewish students being assaulted and intimidated on campus.
Okay.
He mentions cases of protesters forcibly taking over buildings.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
He specifically names Columbia's Hamilton Hall in April 2024.
Right.
And Barnard College's Millbank Hall in February.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this really concerning thing he brings up about the creation of what he calls Zionist-free or no-go zones.
Yeah, I read about that too.
For Jewish students on campus.
That's pretty disturbing.
It is.
Yeah.
He also talks about claims that protesters have called for the deportation of Jews living in Israel.
Wow.
Even specifically mentioning Poland as like a place they should be sent to.
That's a very specific and loaded historical reference.
It is,
Yeah.
and it gets even more intense.
Yeah.
He talks about allegations of janitorial staff being held against their will during these building takeovers.
Oh, gosh.
Vandalism, like buildings being defaced and windows smashed, and even cases where Jewish professors were reportedly blocked from entering their own buildings.
Wow, so this is where he kind of circles back to that George Wallace analogy.
Exactly, blocking people based on their identity.
And he doesn't just stop at Columbia.
Oh, so there's more.
He mentions similar incidents reported at Yale,
Okay.
UCLA,
Wow.
even in the New York City subway system.
So this is something he sees as happening more broadly.
Yeah, not just isolated to one place.
Okay.
Now, obviously, all of this raises a big question.
Yeah, about free speech, right?
Exactly.
Like, where's the line?
Yeah. Is this protected under the First Amendment?
Yeah.
What's Epstein's take on that?
Well, he's pretty clear that he doesn't think these actions are protected by free speech.
Okay.
He's saying they go way beyond just peacefully expressing your views.
Right.
He sees them as illegal activities,
Okay.
and he thinks they're grounds for both deportation, if someone's not a citizen, and for criminal prosecution.
This is calling for serious consequences.
He is.
Yeah.
He's not messing around.
And then he brings up a specific case.
Okay.
The detention of Mahmoud Khalil by ICE.
Who's that?
He was associated with Columbia University apartheid divest.
Oh, CUA, right? They've been pretty active.
They have, and according to Epstein,
Yeah.
Khalil was detained because he was accused of endorsing or espousing terrorist activity.
Oh, wow. That's a serious charge.
It is.
What was the evidence for that?
Well, Epstein points to CUA's public reaction to the October 7th attack.
Okay.
Their statements about, fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization,
Oh, gosh.
allegations that they spread Haas propaganda,
Yeah.
and even a new lawsuit
What?
that claims CUA had advanced knowledge of the October 7th attacks
Wow.
and coordinated with Iran and Hamas.
That's huge if it's true.
It is.
Yeah.
So Epstein argues that endorsing terrorist activity is a clear reason for deportation under immigration law.
Okay, so he's saying deportation is justified in some cases,
Right.
but he also wants to go beyond that.
Yes. He's a big advocate for criminal prosecution.
Yeah. Right.
As well in certain situations.
Okay.
And he specifically points to federal hate crime laws. So which laws is he talking about?
So he focuses on two main ones.
Okay.
First, there's Section 245,
All right.
which is often called the Federal Hate Crime Statute.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
It basically prohibits using force or threats of force
Yeah?
to harm, intimidate, or interfere with someone because of their race, color, religion, or national origin.
Right.
And here's the key. It applies if that person is participating in or benefiting from a program that gets federal money.
So how does that connect to universities?
Well, universities like Columbia get a ton of federal funding.
Right.
So Epstein's argument is that this law could be used to protect Jewish students who are targeted.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What's the other law?
It's Section 241.
Right.
And this one's about conspiracies to threaten or intimidate someone from exercising their constitutional rights.
So this is more about like preventing people from speaking out or expressing themselves freely.
Exactly.
Got it.
And he says this one's especially important for U.S. citizens
Right.
who can't be deported.
It gives them legal protection.
Yeah.
Okay, now Epstein doesn't hold back when it comes to criticizing how officials have reacted to all of this.
Oh, really?
What does he say about President Biden and other Democratic leaders?
Well, he's pretty harsh.
Okay.
He calls Biden's response to these anti-Semitic incidents a sheepish shrug.
Oh, wow.
Like he's not taking it seriously enough.
Yeah.
And he thinks it might be because Biden doesn't want to alienate the far left.
Interesting.
He also points out that other Democratic officials have been pretty quiet on this issue, which he contrasts with what he thinks would be a much stronger response if similar things were happening to other minority groups.
I see.
So he's saying there's a double standard.
Okay, so it's not just about what's happening on campuses.
Right.
But also about how leaders are responding.
Exactly.
Oh.
And then he does something kind of unexpected.
What's that?
He says that all of this could actually be an opportunity for the Trump administration.
Oh, how so?
Well, he argues that Trump could basically score one for democracy by taking a really strong stance on enforcing equal protection on campuses. And by actually prosecuting these crimes.
I see.
He even brings up a statistic from the ADL.
What's that?
Saying that very few of the thousands of anti-Semitic incidents since October 7th have actually led to prosecutions.
So he's saying there's a lack of enforcement.
Yeah, and he thinks Trump could use that to his advantage.
Okay, so it's a political strategy as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then Epstein gets to the heart of something I've been thinking about.
What's that?
This whole idea that these actions are somehow okay.
Right.
Because they're part of a liberation movement.
Yeah, I've heard that argument.
Or that they're protected by free speech.
Mm-hmm.
What does he say about that?
Well, he basically shuts that down completely.
Yeah.
He says you can't excuse violent or discriminatory behavior just because you're calling it part of a movement.
Right.
Or saying it's free speech. He's saying there's no justification for anti-Semitism.
Exactly.
And he thinks it's time to stop making excuses for it.
Okay, so to sum it all up,
yeah, let's bring it back to the main points.
what are the key takeaways from Epstein's argument about prosecuting student protesters?
Well, first, he connects it to the civil rights era,
Yeah.
emphasizing the role of federal power in protecting equal rights.
Got it.
Then he lays out all these specific allegations of illegal and discriminatory actions,
Right.
particularly against Jewish students.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes a strong comparison to bigotry against other minorities.
Yeah. And then he argues that these actions are not protected by free speech.
Right.
And that they could be grounds for deportation or prosecution.
Right.
And finally, he criticizes the weak response from officials and calls for stricter enforcement of the law. So he's painting a pretty clear picture of what he thinks needs to happen.
He is.
It's definitely a lot to think about
It is.
as we wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
I think it's worth leaving our listener with a really thought-provoking question.
Okay.
Something to ponder as they consider all of this.
Sure.
How do we as a society balance the right to protest and free speech, which are so important,
Absolutely.
with the need to keep everyone safe and ensure equal access to education?
Yeah, especially on college campuses.
Exactly.
It's a tough one.
It is. And then when those lines are crossed,
Right.
what are the implications of prosecuting student protesters? Are there unintended consequences we need to consider?
Yeah, it's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we encourage you, our listener, to really wrestle with these questions and maybe even check out Epstein's article directly
It's worth a read for sure.
to see his full argument.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
You got it.